for having me yet.
Hey, we're live.
Hey, calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
I hear, Chris, do you have any proof, signature verification, anything that you can help me out with to make sure that it's really Chris Anderson in London?
I do. I have my Chris Anderson fan club, Winston Churchill, Chris Anderson lookalike pin.
That does it, I think. Some people thought maybe Winston Churchill was here, but now we know it's you, so it looks good. So, hi, everybody. We'll wait a moment for people to join us and get started for real. And please post something to let us know you are here so we don't have to keep making up things to talk about.
No.
And we're here talking about history every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. And all our broadcasts are also archived on the History Happy Hour webpage. And I was just saying to Chris, it's like a master's degree graduate seminar, only you don't have to pay for it.
We'll be setting out the tuition bill.
Right. Also, you don't get a degree, but in every other way, it's just like that.
We don't even have like cool T-shirts or anything.
Oh,
right?
well, I know. I think we have to depend on our audience. Someone's gonna. Where's Ted? Isn't Ted gonna? Or Doreen? Aren't they gonna get the T-shirts going? Hey, Robert and Kevin and Lizzie, and who else have we got?
Ted, Gene, Doreen,
Jack.
Hey, Lizzie.
And we may have some folks here who haven't been here before, and so you'll have to learn our traditions as you go. But
and
we
make sure you
welcome
don't scare them off.
We welcome you, and Lizzie Borden in London. Hi. So do we have critical mass yet?
I think we do.
We do. Oh my God! So what does that mean we have to do?
Bum.
And the bar is open, and I'm sure our guest is really impressed with our high-tech open there.
I'm sure he is.
Our subject today is this cocky-looking guy, Sergeant Bill Mauldin. He was just 23 years old when he rocketed to fame in World War II with his Willie and Joe cartoons that offered readers of Stars and Stripes, as well as hundreds of hometown newspapers, a gritty view from the foxholes. And legendary journalist Ernie Pyle declared Mauldin the finest cartoonist the war had produced, and a whole lot of World War II veterans agree with that. But what many people don't realize is, Chris, is that Mauldin had a second and even a third act as a political cartoonist, spanning another 45 years. And the two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, in the words of Chris Anderson, which I am stealing here, brought his acerbic wit and eye for the absurd to some of post-war America's most important issues and events. See, I quote you. I hope you're impressed with that.
I am.
And sometimes in his later cartoons, igniting the anger of the same audiences who adored his World War II work. And okay, so great cartoonist, also an actor, a writer, and at one time a candidate for Congress. So looking at his career, you shake your head and wonder how he crammed all this stuff in. And our guest today is Todd DePastino, Mauldin biographer and editor of the new book, Drawing Fire, the editorial cartoons of Bill Mauldin, and it's published by our friends at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library just down the street here in Chicago. And it's filled with cartoons covering his entire career, not just the war career. And Todd has a Ph.D. in history from Yale. Woo! That is good, Todd. And currently serves as executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, a nonprofit dedicated to sharing veteran stories with the public. Todd, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you for having me. You should definitely have shirts. And Chris, I think one guest should be Winston Churchill.
They're always. Yeah.
He's already been on the show.
Oh, he has? Okay.
Yeah. So Todd, what are you drinking today?
I'm drinking a Pumpkin from Southern Tier Brewing, Lakewood, New York. It's not far from where I live in Pittsburgh, PA. It's kind of a heavier pumpkin ale.
Right.
It's pumpkin pie in a bottle. That's how it's.
Oh.
Yeah. And I just thought it was seasonal. You could take a look behind me.
It goes with your background, yeah. It does that.
Todd's a little upsetting to us because he's actually got a way more professional setup than either Chris or I do. So with his studio there, and it's a little of concern that he's showing us up this way, but we're kind of willing to go along with it.
Well, we have our own Veterans Breakfast Club happy hour, and that's why we have the setup here. I have the setup here.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Do it so well.
And I just want to say we actually have a program called Greatest Generation Live, where we tell World War II stories, and it's on Sundays at 4, but we've preempted our program today for this.
That is the most gracious thing imaginable, and we seriously appreciate that very much. And Chris, what are you drinking?
Oh, I'm ashamed to say I'm drinking water.
Wow.
Because last night I celebrated England's victory over Ireland in football a little bit too extensively, so I'm rehydrating.
Well, I have a German Hefeweizen,
Ooh.
and figuring that without the Germans, we never would have really gotten to appreciate the cartooning of Bill Mauldin.
That's true.
There you go.
So Todd, speaking of Bill Mauldin, since we're going to leap right in here, one of the great quotes in the book that I just loved was from his grandmother, who said that Bill was the angriest baby she ever saw.
Yeah.
So why was he so angry?
I mean, that was the question. I mean, that was the big question of the biography, is what made him such a combative personality in his entire life. If he was not dealing with a crisis, if he was not championing a cause, he was self-sabotaging. So he had to be like in the mix. He had to be mixing it up somehow. He had to be defending he had to have a cause. And boy, if he didn't have a cause, he got into trouble. So political cartooning was just the perfect career for him, because when you're a political cartoonist, you don't make rational arguments. You don't, you commit every cognitive fallacy, cognitive bias, you hit below the belt. I mean, it is not a fair fight. And that was him. He fought dirty. And he had lifelong kind of, enemies, and he fought battles constantly, and usually they were for good.
So, but he had a pretty rough upbringing. I mean,
yeah,
I don't think people realize. Yeah, could you maybe talk just briefly about where he's coming from?
He was a hillbilly, as his self-described hillbilly from the mountains of southern New Mexico. His father was a kind of a professional hellraiser, a World War I veteran who had been gassed in World War I. He was a heavy drinker. He was a very smart guy, an apple farmer, but he was unsteady, unstable. He liked to settle disputes in southern New Mexico with his revolver. His mother was also unsteady and unstable. They got divorced when Mauldin was 14 years old. So he and his older brother, age 15, pulled an old Model T Ford from the family junk pile and drove it to Phoenix and started new lives on their own together, ages 14 and 15 in 1936.
As you would, right?
Wow.
I mean, the guy raised himself, and he was considered. I mean, in Alamogordo, or where he was from, Mountain Park, New Mexico, he was considered kind of the runt of the litter. He was sickly as a child. He had rickets. He had tuberculosis. He was small in stature. He had these strange big ears. He said they were like open doors on a taxi cab. And he got into more fights than anybody on the mountain, and he lost every one of them, he said. So he had this prickly personality, but the one thing that he did have was intellectual genius. I mean, the kid was kind of drawing pretty elaborate drawings at age 3 or 4. He was reading novels at age 5 or 6. He was, he could do puzzles and mathematic computations, but kind of where he came from, it didn't really matter, because he couldn't carry out regular farm chores. So, but a couple members of his family, maternal grandmother, saw promise in him and kind of fed his intellectual curiosity. And that, in the end, is absolutely what saved him.
He becomes famous, world famous at age 23 as a cartoonist in Europe. But it's not an overnight success, really, because what leads up to it is a tremendous amount of effort and work ethic and preparation and sort of self-imposed training. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it was a severe regimen. It was very much akin in the biography. I compare it to Jack London. I mean, Jack London at age 16, age 18, realized he did not want to be a manual laborer, so he taught himself how to write. Bill Mauldin did the same thing. He taught himself how to cartoon. He had no money, he had no formal training, he had dropped out of high school, so he knew that. But he could have done a lot of different things, but he knew cartooning was probably the thing that he could make the most amount of money the quickest with. And so he began cartooning professionally at age 13, 14, even before he left Mountain Park, New Mexico. And he had enough money at $500, put himself through 1 year at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. And he had this demanding regimen every night, that 1 year in Chicago, where every single night he did 10 original cartoons.
Wow.
And sent them out to 10 magazines every single night for 1 full year. He ended up selling just like 6 or 7.
But
to
it's
Arizona
actually
highways.
it's even cooler than that, and we're pulling. You talk about this in Drawing Fire. He's sending out cartoons he's sending 10 cartoons to the New Yorker, but he's getting the rejection notices from the ones he sent a week before, and now he's putting them in another envelope and sending them to the next magazine down the tier. And at any night, he's got about 10 different envelopes of cartoons going out.
Completely shuffling the envelopes every night. He would go to bed at 3 or 4 a.m. He would smoke cigarettes and stay up all night. And yeah, he'd take the New Yorker rejection cartoon, put it in the Collier's envelope, post that one, then take the Collier's rejection cartoon, put it in the Saturday Evening Post envelope. I mean, that's and he did that every single night. 10 original ideas. And he said what he taught him was, it taught him how to come up with ideas quickly and how to draw quickly, compose. When you're a political cartoonist, you have to be original, funny, insightful all at once every day. That's a really hard job. You are under a tight deadline, and you have to produce. You have to produce.
So it's like the Malcolm Gladwell scenario here, with
10,000 hours.
Yeah. So
Definitely.
I mean, obviously he had some natural talents, and he had that one semester. But two questions. One is, did you encounter anything where he said, I saw a cartoon by X and that inspired me, or he just doodled and he kind of arrived at this by himself? I mean,
he would absolutely. He would never talk about his inspiration. He would say that his inspiration was an article in Popular Mechanics that said that Chick Young, who created Blondie, made $100,000 a year. That was his inspiration. He wanted to escape poverty.
Sure.
Now, he was an artist. He was a serious artist. And I think secretly he took himself seriously as an artist, but he would never admit that. He would say, I'm a cartoonist, which is what you call a failed artist.
Right. So now, do any of, we're all familiar with the World War II cartoons, and I want to get into that, obviously, but are there any did he keep any of these early ones, these survivors, and do they show the same kind of sarcasm, and are they as biting as?
No, they're not. They're good. They're good. Yeah. They're good cartoons. They're good, goofy gag cartoons. They feature a lot. He's from the West. They feature a lot of Native Americans. They feature a lot of cowboys, horses. He loved to draw trains and planes and automobiles. He loved mechanical drawing. So there are a lot of sight gag cartoons. Pigeon Indian English cartoons. But the cartoons turn really serious once he experiences combat for the first time. And one riddle I never quite unlocked was how his style changed so dramatically, so quickly in the mountains of southern Italy during the Italian campaign. It's like he got shot at for the first time, and his whole style changed very rapidly.
There's so to kind of get to that point, it's worth mentioning that. Because he's not making enough money as an artist there in the West, he enlists. He's serving as an infantryman in the 45th Division and doing a little part-time cartooning for the division newspaper. They go over to Italy, and eventually, as things work out, he hooks up with Stars and Stripes and becomes a full-time cartoonist for the 45th Division magazine or newspaper, then for Stars and Stripes. Go ahead.
You wouldn't mind me interrupting you. I want to share my screen to show
go ahead.
A kind of cartoon that he was doing in training with the 45th Infantry Division. He joined the 45th Division in September of 1940, right before it was federalized. Actually, he joined the Arizona National Guard right before it was federalized and made part of the 45th Division, and so he wasn't given a medical, he wasn't given a any kind of medical review. He said they kind of counted my eyes. They didn't really look at him. And if he had been examined, he would have not been able to enter the Army because he was underweight and malnourished. He joined the Army because he was hungry. He needed 3 meals a day. He was unemployed, and he immediately volunteered to do cartoons for the 45th Infantry Division News. And these are the kind of cartoons he was doing right away. He loved the infantry, but you could see there's Joe, the Indian, sitting down. He's a Choctaw Indian. The 45th Division was probably the most ethnically diverse division in a racially segregated military that the U.S. had. There were a large number of Native Americans in that division, as well as a large number of Mexican Americans. And Bill was in a minority of Anglos in the division. So you have the soldier on the right sitting down is Joe. He's a Choctaw Indian. And then you have a soldier on the left who's Willie. And they're marching through mud. And these are training cartoons. These are like, he is reflecting the life of the infantry grunt in training back home, back to the infantrymen who are reading these cartoons in the 45th Division News. So the infantrymen loved him because the infantry was on the lowest rung of all the military branches in World War II. Right, so that's what it looked like before he saw combat, and this is how it was transformed very quickly after his combat. It gets rougher, more rough-hewn. The lines get thicker. The mud gets deeper. The jokes get a lot more serious. I wish I could stand up and get some sleep. You really get a sense of just the discomfort, everyday discomfort of life at war.
And I think that, first of all, Todd, we want to say you're the first guest in 35 weeks that we've allowed to share a screen. And this is a new technology moment for History Happy Hour. It's almost worth a toast for that. I think a lot of our audience is familiar, but perhaps not all are familiar with these characters who become legendary cartoon characters, Willie and Joe, the combat infantrymen. And although he is becoming famous before Willie and Joe, they are really what cements his fame. So talk a little bit about sort of how he gets there and maybe share a few of those cartoons with us.
Yeah, he gets there really with, he was a rifleman in the 45th Infantry Division. He trained with them, shipped overseas with them, landed in North Africa, and then was at his first beach invasion, which was the invasion of Sicily on July 10th, 1943. And that's where he saw his first combat experience. I mean, that night that he landed, a call was put out, and I've talked to plenty of 45th Division vets who remember this very well. A call was put out, look out for paratroopers, and thinking that the Germans are going to drop paratroopers on their positions in Sicily near Scaliti. It turns out it was the 82nd Airborne at night, jumping from planes, and the 45th Division shot him down. I mean, he woke up the next day and saw dead American airborne troops hanging in trees that had been killed by friendly fire. He said this was his first lesson of war. Nobody knows what they're doing. And it was in that kind of environment, the kind of chaotic, extremely high-stress environment, that Mauldin did his best work. And I've heard this before from veterans, very eloquent veterans who talk about the combat experience. Many of them will say that your senses just get sharpened. Your perspective gets sharpened. Eric Severide, who was a great correspondent during World War II, he said, you see a tree for the first time in all its treeness. I mean, combat gives you new eyes with which to view the world, new ears with which to hear it. And it is like he incorporated that new sensibility, that new perspective in his cartoons. And he focused right away on the power of, the buddies. It's like the cartoons are like a buddy movie. You have Willie and Joe. They're two buddies, and he always imagined them as very different. They would never have been friends in ordinary life. One was older, one was younger, one was maybe conservative, one was liberal, one was maybe more educated. And he said, but the thing about combat is you become closer than you are even to your own family. And so they had this bond that was unbreakable. They supported each other and they saved each other. And that was the ethic, I think, that pushed, and the sweetness. The beauty, his cartoons are really about love. Mm-hmm. That's what they're really about. a kind of love that's hard to capture and hard for those who don't experience combat to understand.
Well, one of the things that I find very compelling too is that he becomes famous, and he's achieved that thing that he wanted, which is fame and financial. But as you said, from that first combat experience, he picks the infantry and he says, "I'm telling their story, and my audience is them. And if all you people in the other branches and the public and civilians, if you want to come along for the ride, that's great." But he doesn't really, leave that audience.
Yeah.
Which I find really kind of interesting. He doesn't.
And it's hard for us to think back to 1941, 1942 even, when the infantry really, I had mentioned, was on the lowest rung of the military hierarchy. I mean, all the publicity was going to the elite groups, Army Rangers and the Marine Corps and airborne troops, and everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot or even a bomber pilot. Even the Merchant Marine had their own movie with Humphrey Bogart.
Right.
The construction battalions, naval construction battalions, had their own movie. The Fighting Seabees. I mean, and that was on purpose. The War Department in 1940, 1941 really thought that if they were going to fight a two-front war, it was going to be won through high technology, long-range artillery, high explosive artillery, air power. That Army infantry was going to really just kind of sweep in to police up after elite units had already taken the ground. So the infantry is where you ended up if you were, like Mauldin, unemployed. The infantry was where you ended up if you had never worn shoes, if you had no skills, if you couldn't read or write, if you came from the kind of background that Bill Mauldin came from. He served with people who were not fit or equipped for the more elite branches of service. And so the infantry was derided, it was neglected. They got World War I vintage equipment. They were given no respect. I mean, truly no respect and no publicity. Mauldin was really one of the first, along with the great Ernie Pyle, to cast attention onto the critical role of the infantry, because it was there where Mauldin was in Italy in 1943 that the War Department realized they were wrong, that they were going to need masses of infantry to win this war. It was going to be a long, difficult slog, and no amount of air power was ever going to evict the Germans from those mountains of southern Italy.
And maybe, Todd, you can pull up a couple more of the Willie and Joe cartoons if you have them there on ready to go. But as you're doing that, what I was going to say is, one of the things that a lot of veterans talk about that is upsetting to them, probably the two things that are most upsetting, and they're really the same thing. One is anything that's chicken shit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is officers. And
I just showed it Officer Cartoon. Yeah.
Well, pull that up again, because I just haven't brought it up yet. We're experimenting with this technology, folks. It's
I know you just praised me for
brave new
no
world.
pressure, Todd.
And I'm
really
screwing it up here.
I do praise you.
Here we go.
But anyway, and I wanted to say that there was a Ghost Army soldier. Ghost Army, we all have to take a drink. And for anybody who doesn't know what that is, that's the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops Deception Unit.
And Rick would be happy to tell you more about it later.
Call me, we'll talk. He wrote in his diary one day, we're eating by rank, he said, meaning that the officers are getting better food than the enlisted men. I wish I could shit on every officer in my company. And so it seems to me that this attitude, as chicken shit, and as expressed by Bob Tompkins, that this is pretty much in line with the sort of the troublemaking attitude of Bill Mauldin.
Yeah, man, that was it. Yeah, the gap between enlisted men and officers was really big in World War II, far bigger than it is today, or that it would be in Korea or Vietnam. And so there was a lot of rancor between, especially officers in the rear, and then combat enlisted men in the front. And I want to point out this cartoon, Wish to Hell I Wasn't Housebroke. And I ask the viewers to just look at it. This is the only reference I know of during World War II to like a really fundamental fact of life in combat on the front lines. When you're stuck in a foxhole for days or weeks on end, like these men were, when you have to go, you have to choose between kind of exposing yourself to fire or going in your own foxhole. And this was just like an everyday indignity and everyday discomfort. Nobody back home ever thought about this at all. Why would you ever think about it? But Mauldin was bringing just tiny little slices of life like this back to the home front. And that's why I think the home front was so riveted. They had no idea the conditions under which these men were living.
And I think that's also, we talked about Pyle. Pyle is a great admirer of Bill, and he says his cartoons are good. They're funny, yeah, but they're good because they're real. They're authentic. And so, he's giving a window on something that, no idea.
The socks, the trench foot was such a big problem. Medical science still doesn't know why our feet can't handle water for a long time. But if our feet are wet for more than a few days at a time, bad things start to happen. You could get your feet amputated. So trench foot was a really big problem in Italy. Dry socks was critical. Every infantryman in Italy would understand and appreciate this cartoon. But the folks back home just kind of scratched their heads. What are they talking about?
Yeah.
And then here's a classic officer. Beautiful view. Is there one for the enlisted men? That was very much, Mauldin was a three-stripe sergeant. He came out of the army a three-stripe sergeant, and he was a champion of the enlisted men, and he was a champion of the infantry. His entire life he was.
One of the stories, I just want to stick it in here. Todd and Rick and I, we talked about this before the show, but years and years ago when I still collected military antiques, I had a photo album of an infantry soldier, and Bill Mauldin comes to visit the unit. And it's after Bill has achieved some fame because he's got his jump boots and he's showed up in his Jeep. And there must be about 20 photographs. Every single one of them, Bill is with an enlisted person. There's not a single officer in any of the photographs, which I think says an awful lot.
Yes. He, officers generally didn't like Mauldin. There absolutely was a conspiracy to try and remove his cartoons from Stars and Stripes. And again, I want to remind our viewers that Stars and Stripes had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the world in 1944, 1945. So when Mauldin gets plucked from the 45th Division in early 1944 and put on Stars and Stripes, it's like going from the Paducah Gazette to the New York Times overnight. I mean, it's just, he's exposed now to millions of readers around the world. And there were a lot of officers who didn't like it. They didn't like his messy characters. They didn't like his sardonic attitude, his anti-officer attitude. Didn't square.
And one of those officers was General George S. Patton, wasn't he? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Patton, Patton, he didn't seem to have much of a sense of humor. So I don't think he ever really got a lot of the humor, but he saw Mauldin's cartoons for the first time in Sicily in the 45th Division News. And what he didn't like about them was that they were disheveled. Patton was spit and polish. He was, your helmet had to be polished. You had to wear a tie in combat in a foxhole, you had to always look good. And Willie and Joe looked anything but good. They were as disheveled as they could possibly be, 5 o'clock shadow constantly, always dirty, always muddy, always slightly out of uniform. And Patton saw the cartoons in the 45th Division News, and he went to the commander of the 45th Division, a general named Troy Middleton, and he said to Middleton, "Get rid of that cartoonist." And Middleton said, "I can't get rid of Mauldin. My men love him. If I get rid of him, I'll have a mutiny on my hands." And Patton said, "I don't care. Get rid of him." And Middleton said, "Put it in writing, please." And Patton never got around to putting it in writing because he was soon pulled out of Sicily, if you remember, because he slapped a couple soldiers. He accused of malingering. So Patton was, and that allowed, if Patton had not been removed, there's a very good chance we wouldn't be talking about Bill Mauldin today, because Patton would have been able to remove Mauldin. He would never have been placed on Stars and Stripes. But getting Patton out of the way allowed officers like Dwight Eisenhower and others, General Mark Clark, Lucian Truscott, most famously, to kind of promote Mauldin, because they knew that Mauldin was so important to the morale of the infantry. And then Patton and Mauldin would meet again in 1945. We
don't
want to ruin that. We'll save that. Yeah.
So Todd, how did Bill get plucked to go to Stars and Stripes? Because as you said, it's such a big step. I mean, who finds him or who says, "Hey, this guy here"?
Great question. Yeah, that was a question.
You get the great question, Chris.
Yeah.
What's that mean?
Well,
Do I
you
drink?
said great. No, that he won a great question.
Ghost
award.
Army? Okay.
You got Ghost Army. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Now we're confusing Todd. It's a lot going on, Todd. So
it is a lot.
Let him answer my great question.
You didn't have to drink there. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, he was. What really promoted Mauldin was just what I was talking about before. The recognition in two recognitions in the September, October, November of 1943 by the War Department. The first was that infantry's critical. Like, we're going to need masses of infantry to win this war. There was something, they started canceling programs. They started washing out pilots, putting them in the infantry. I mean, packing and packing the infantry for the horrendous beach invasions they knew were going to come. And it was a morale lowering experience to be taken from, the Air Corps and put in the infantry. And so they needed to kind of promote the infantry, but nobody was buying that the infantry was, this gung-ho branch of service. But what people did respond to, infantrymen especially, were the Willie and Joe images. They represented kind of the infantry attitude, the rugged independence of the infantry.
But do you know, who it was that said, "Hey, God, this cartoon, we got to get him on Stars and Stripes"?
It was the Stars and Stripes editors themselves. Yeah. Oh yeah, it was the Naples edition of Stars and Stripes recognized the genius of Mauldin and really worked to get him on Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes was unusual, although it was a global newspaper. Each edition was fiercely independent. There were many different editions, a dozen different editions around the world. So London had an edition, Paris had an edition, Naples, Rome, and they each were slightly different. They each had, they were manned by different kind of officers and with different political bent. And it just so happened that the Naples office was really pro-infantry and really believed that the infantry was getting a raw deal. And so they loved Ernie Pyle. And they loved Mauldin, and they knew it would be a huge coup for them to get Mauldin on Stars and Stripes. They managed to get him placed on Stars and Stripes, and it also came at a time. And I know I'm talking a lot, but it also came at a time.
Well, it's your job.
It's actually your job here today.
It came at a time when the War Department was realizing that Americans were suffering from a problem of rising expectations. In the early part of the war, all the bond posters, all the advertisements, all the movies, everything you read about the war was good news. You got nothing but good news. Morale's always high. We're winning every battle. Our men are clean cut and eager and gung ho. They're well trained. The enemy is cutting and running. And so by September 1943, the war, there's 40% of the population who believes that World War II is going to be over by Christmas 1943. They're believing the propaganda. Yeah. And so the War Department knows that they have to sober the American people up. They have to give Americans a little dose of reality that the enemy is lethal, that the war is going to be a long, difficult slog, and that we have men overseas who are suffering more than you are back home with the coffee rationing and the sugar rationing and the gasoline rationing that you're bitching and moaning about. Don't bitch and moan about the rationing because there are men dying overseas. And for the first time, the War Department allows to be released a photo of a dead American. The first time ever. The cover of Life magazine, September 1943. Many Americans who were alive then remember seeing that picture for the first time. It was shocking. 3 dead Americans at Buna Beach, New Guinea. It was and Mauldin's cartoons were just perfect for that kind of new publicity campaign. They were just grim enough, they were just dark enough to kind of sober the American people and prepare them for a longer, more difficult war with higher casualties.
We could probably take the whole hour talking about World War II, and I'm sure many people would enjoy that. But we do want to touch on the rest of his career. I first want to say, again, that we're talking with Todd DePastino, who's the editor of Drawing Fire, also wrote a biography of Mauldin called A Life Up Front, which is excellent. I'm not done with that one yet, but I'm getting there. And
You haven't started, have you?
I'm 100.
I like him.
I'm 200 pages in, for heaven's sake, and I only started on Friday, so stop it. But I want to ask you, before we deal with the post-war, I want to ask you, Todd, how did you get interested in this topic? Are you a military historian or
No.
A literary historian? What is your point of entry here? I see the sun is starting to
No,
shine.
I've got to pull my blinds, but I'd have to step away. I'm a social and cultural historian. That's how I was trained, of the Gilded Age and Progressive era. My first book was based on my dissertation, which was a history of homelessness in America, Citizen Hobo: How a Century of Homelessness Shaped America. My favorite review on Amazon of it is that, boy, is this book a snoozer. It's really a study of hobo subculture, hobo counterculture.
You know how to market, man.
I know.
How to market.
And it's more of an academic book. And as I was, finishing that book, I was really struggling with the collapse of the hobo subculture, the homeless male subculture in World War II. And I mentioned to several people, one of which was my wife's aunt, that hobos just disappear with World War II. And he was an infantry soldier in World War II, and he said they didn't disappear; they got drafted. I served with them, and he mentioned Bill Mauldin, Willie and Joe. And absolutely, I knew Willie and Joe from the Charles Schulz Peanuts tributes every year, when Snoopy goes out to quaff a few root beers with Bill Mauldin for Veterans Day. But I hadn't, looked at the cartoons closely. And I went back and looked at the cartoons, and absolutely, sure enough, they're Weary Willie in olive drab. They're the classic hobo stereotype, but in the Army. And I realized, first of all, that Mauldin is drawing off this rich cultural heritage of depicting tramps and hobos and homeless men as a cultural figure. But second, that the cartoons are just brilliant. He did 700 of these during World War II, and collectively they're one of the great masterpieces of the 20th century. They show you a slice of what it's like to serve in the military, what it's like to serve in war, that I'd never seen before. And furthermore, he wasn't much studied. He was kind of served as a cameo, as a walk-on in histories of World War II. But the more I found out about his life, and 3 marriages and 8 children, and last wife younger than 3 of his children, and he ran for Congress and quit cartooning, and became a political cartoonist, a Hollywood actor. Just the whole story. He's such a charismatic figure that it was just irresistible as a subject of a biography. So I wrote a letter to the family. This is, anybody who's working on a biography knows this process. You figure, if you're going to write a biography of somebody, now it's time to approach the family. And this is when it gets hairy, because sometimes families don't want to have a honest depiction of they don't want to cooperate. I wrote a letter to one of his sons, David Mauldin, and then followed up with a phone call. And David said, oh man, do we want Dad's art to be taken seriously? He was such a great artist. It's wonderful to have a scholar who's seriously interested in his work. And please make sure to talk about what a son of a bitch he was. And it's that's like a dream for a biography. A family that understands the historical and cultural importance of the figure, but is willing to face the warts and all kind of approach of a serious biography.
Now, if you've got one more Willie and Joe cartoon that you can put up, do you?
Yeah.
Put it up. We'll talk about it for a minute. Will you go shut the blinds? All right?
All right.
You're going to feel better. We'll interpret it. We can do it. We can do it. All right, you go. Here we go, Chris.
This is like live action.
This is amazing. What do we got here?
Talking about Patton.
You are entering the Third Army. Fines, no helmet, no shave. Well, I did read that when in the biography, that excellent biography that Todd thinks I haven't read, that when he was going to have, Bill Mauldin was going to have a meeting with Patton, which he did, that he did stop and kind of fix up his Jeep and sort of de-customize it a little bit so that it would fit Third Army specifications when he got into Luxembourg, where his headquarters was.
Oh yeah, I mean, Mauldin had to polish his helmet. He had to wear a real uniform. He never wore a real uniform. In Stars and Stripes in Italy, you referred to your officers by their first name. I mean, there was not the traditional military. And then Bill Mauldin had his own Jeep.
Yes,
Nobody had their own Jeep in the entire army, but he had his own Jeep with his.
Lucian Truscott got him, right? Wasn't that right?
Mark Clark, General Mark Clark, the commander of the Fifth Army at the time.
A man who liked publicity of any kind.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, exactly. He sure was a publicity hound. But this cartoon is the one that Mauldin did immediately after his famous meeting with Patton, when Patton dressed him down and told him that the Krauts ought to pin a goddamn medal on him for what he's done for them, for lowering morale and the fighting strength of the Americans, and ordered him to go out and be a good soldier. Mauldin went back to his Jeep, and this is kind of incredible that Mauldin had the foresight to do this. He brought with him from Paris. Mauldin drove from Paris to Luxembourg, where Patton was stationed, for this meeting. That's the only reason he went there. He brought with him Will Lang, who was the Time Life correspondent, war correspondent. And Will Lang was there. They were friends. And Will said to Bill, "So what, you going to give me an exclusive quotation?" And Bill said, "Yeah. Here's my quotation. He gave his point of view. I gave mine. We didn't change each other's minds, but we parted good friends." And then he did this cartoon to be released immediately after the meeting, in conjunction with the Time magazine article on the meeting between Patton, a three-stripe sergeant, and General Patton. And this cartoon is all about Patton's Third Army. George Patton was the commander of the Third Army. You are entering the Third Army. Fines: no helmet, $25. No shave, $10. No buttons, $10. No tie, $25. No shine, $12.50. No shampoo, $25. Windshields up, $25. Trousers down, $50. Enforced by order of Old Blood and Guts. And there's Willie and Joe in the Jeep. Radio the old man will be late on account of a 1,000-mile detour. They're going to drive around Third Army so that they're not arrested, because Mauldin was arrested for being out of uniform.
We are, I swear, going to move to post-war. Chris, you're going to ask the next question, right? It's going to be about the post-war period, right? I'm
sure.
hoping.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
But before we do that, can you put that cartoon back up again? Because I want to point out one thing and just address one thing that Chris touched on before, and I want to mention, which is the degree to which Bill Mauldin took authenticity seriously. And by which I mean the attention to detail. And so part of this is, if you look at this Jeep, and it's got the I don't even know what it's called, but the wire cutter on the front of the Jeep. It's got a box, it's not bungeed because they didn't have bungeed, but it's got a box tied to the top of the Jeep. Whenever he depicts equipment that infantrymen are using, it's extremely important to him to be accurate in every detail.
Yep.
So I just found that really interesting.
Yeah, he said, "Boy, if you don't get it right," and I just know this working with veterans. I'm not a veteran, but I've worked with veterans for 12 years. Yeah, if you get a little detail wrong about any piece of equipment that they use, man, you hear it. If you call a ship a boat or a boat a ship to a sailor, you hear it. You get corrected right away. Yeah, it's so important because as an infantryman, you live, everything that you have, you carry with you. So you live with very few pieces of equipment. Those pieces of equipment are essential to your life, and they resent seeing it depicted wrong.
So Todd, can I move on now, Rick?
Please.
Okay, good. We could, we could obviously talk about the war for the whole show, but I really want to kind of start getting a little bit into his post-war career because I don't think people know enough about it. So he's 23. He's got the Pulitzer. He's famous cartoonist. He could go on. And Ernie Pyle kind of sits him down and says, "Stop. Take off. Stop cartooning. Get away from all of it if you want to be good." So he gets involved in a whole bunch of other things. So what are some of the other things he gets involved with? And then how does he come back to cartooning?
Yeah. I will rush through this story because it's so fascinating. He comes home. He's married and has a child he's never seen. Hasn't seen his wife in a couple years. He comes home. He had left, poor Bill Mauldin. Comes home a millionaire and a celebrity. One of his first days home, he has tea with Eleanor Roosevelt. Seriously, he's meeting.
We've all done that.
Yeah, he's meeting with celebrities are contacting him because they want to meet him. So he tries to kind of fit in back home, and it just is not working. And he wants to take Ernie Pyle's advice seriously. He wants to get out of cartooning. He said, I was like an 18-year-old kid when I joined the Army. I don't know what it's like to be an adult, a civilian. I need time away. And the syndicate, United Feature Syndicate, would not let him out of the contract. They knew he was a gold mine for them. And so he started cartooning about post-war life. And a lot of it was just about domestic rubs with his wife and, Willie and Joe trying to get a job. But over time, the marriage fell apart very quickly. But over time, he really begins to be haunted by how do you justify the catastrophe that I was witness to in World War II. I mean, he saw death and destruction everywhere. And the worse the war got, the richer he became. The worse the war got, the better his cartoons got, and the more important he became. And he lived with that guilt his entire life. He not only survived the war, it's like beyond survivor's guilt. He not only survived the war, he got rich off the war. And he was a war profiteer, I think, deep down. I think that's what he worried that he was. So he was always looking for a way to justify the war. And the way he ended up coming down in the fall of 1945 on was that, the war is justified if America is made better and if the world is made more peaceful and more equal and, freer because of the war. So he really started kind of campaigning for civil rights. This is in 1945, 1946. Equal rights, civil liberties, not rushing into World War III with the Soviet Union. He becomes very political very fast, and man, did readers turn against him for that.
Do you have a couple of those to show?
Yeah.
Because he paints a very, we have this image of America after the war, the guys came home and it was great, and, the veterans build America. But he shows a side of post-war America very often that's kind of challenges that.
Yeah, there was a real resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in 1945, 1946 after the war. There were some high-profile lynchings of African-American soldiers in the South after World War II. There was widespread discrimination, as you probably know, against Japanese Americans in California. And what bothered Bill about that was that he had been witness and friends with members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the Nisei combat element that fought with such valor in Italy and southern France and Germany. And when these when these soldiers went home, these Nisei soldiers, these Japanese American soldiers went back to California, like in this cartoon, they would go into a bar and there'd be a sign taped up like that. You can see in the back, "No Japs allowed, America for Americans." And there's a wounded, Japanese American soldier. This kind of discrimination absolutely enraged Mauldin. Enraged him. Here's another cartoon he did about that. Here's a Japanese grocer now taken over by a white Anglo, and the caption is, "Nah, we don't have to worry about the owner coming back. He was killed in Italy." That's pretty dark. That is pretty dark. And of course, he covered the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan with many cartoons. This is one of them. He just, he would always say that one thing a bully hates is to be laughed at.
Go home, Junior. You're making me look silly. Right.
So, but what was the reaction to this turn?
The reaction was fierce. Man, they did not want these kind of, the syndicate was fairly conservative, and most of the papers, and there were 300 of them that subscribed to Mauldin's cartoons, they were pretty conservative. This was a hot button issue. They didn't want, they wanted him to be funny. They didn't want him to be sharp and sardonic. He argued that he had always been sharp and sardonic, that his cartoons had always had a political flavor to them. And so they started changing, they started censoring his cartoons, changing the captions. They would white out offensive pieces that they saw, offensive figures that they saw in the drawing. His contract allowed them to do it. He would hit back twice as hard. Here was a good fight that he would would engage.
This, Todd, interestingly mirrors the experience of some other journalists who came back, and I think of Edward R. Murrow, his famous broadcasts from London. This is London, to the United States, and bringing the country together. But then he comes back, and he wants to sort of do editorials and commentaries that are much in line with what Bill Mauldin is doing, and suddenly it's like, no, we don't want those commentaries. We don't want you editorializing now. We want you to be what you used to be. Do your old stuff.
Yeah, it was a disillusioning experience coming home. I mean, for Mauldin, the army, the war, being overseas, serving in this multi-ethnic, multinational allied force, seeing so much of the world, seeing how so many different peoples from all over the world suffered during the war. It was an eye-opening, transformative experience, and he came back a different person. And I think he assumed that the country had changed also, that the country had opened up, opened up to Russians, opened up to refugees, opened up to the suffering masses of the world. And he found that wasn't the case, that in fact, Americans were pretty eager to kind of close up again, to go back to America first and close borders. And there was a big debate about should we allow refugees, displaced persons from World War II to come into the country. Mauldin, of course, took up their cause. And I think it was disillusioning for him to find that the country didn't see things the way he did.
Do you think Bill ever got over the war?
No, he never did. No, he never did. He took the war. I mean, at the end of his life, he was so sick and he had dementia. He didn't really recognize friends or family. The only people he recognized were fellow GIs. Those are the only, on his deathbed, he knew who the GIs were. He knew, he remembered World War II, but he didn't remember anything else. That was by far the most meaningful part of his life, but it was the part he was always trying to escape. What do you do? I mean, he tells a great story that he's sitting in a steam room with Orson Welles in Hollywood in 1946.
Well, we've all done that.
We've all been there. Yeah, this is at a time when Mauldin is writing for Hollywood before he actually acted. And he's sitting in the steam room, and Welles had always wanted to meet Mauldin, really admired him, and said to Mauldin, you and I are just the same, kid. That, we both got too much too fast, and we have to figure out how to live the rest of our lives. And Mauldin never forgot that. That was it. He was, what do you do when you reach the peak at 23? How do you spend the rest of your life? That was a challenge for Mauldin. So he spent his life running away from the war, in a sense, trying to reinvent himself after World War II, and he never really could. He was traumatized by the war. He absolutely had post-traumatic stress that he didn't deal with well, and it never left him.
Well, and he kind of has this intermission where he leaves cartooning, and I think we're going to have to kind of skip over it. But
you're trying to move me along, and I understand.
I am. Yeah, he's in a movie with Audie Murphy, Red Badge of Courage. He runs for Congress in New York. He writes a book about his childhood.
He becomes an airplane pilot. Yeah,
but he goes back to cartooning, and he is still successful, but he's now it's a much more of a political cartooning.
Yeah, the guy's a genius. He gets back into political cartooning in 1958 with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He spends 4 years there. Within 6 months, he wins another Pulitzer Prize. And then he moves to the Chicago Sun-Times and ends up spending 30 years there. And he's remembered as kind of the dean of American political cartooning, along with Herb Block with the Washington Post. And he did some of the most memorable cartoons of the mid and late 20th century.
Do you have his Kennedy cartoon on your in queue there?
I do. Let me share it.
Of course, John Kennedy assassinated in November of 1963. Tell us the story of this cartoon, Todd.
Mauldin was at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. When he heard that Kennedy, he was at a luncheon there. When he heard that Kennedy had been assassinated, everybody went home. He instead went to the office. It was his day off. And he realized if he could get a cartoon in for the next day's paper, he had to do it. And he went to the editors, and the editors told him he had an hour. So he really cast about, what do I do for the Kennedy assassination? He thought of the Lincoln Memorial. He, thought of the parallels with Abraham Lincoln, and came up with this idea of Lincoln grieving, kind of in disbelief with his head in his hands. It was the fastest Mauldin ever really drew a cartoon. He didn't like it, actually. He said that the hair the hairline was wrong. He got Kennedy's hairline instead of Lincoln's hairline. He was very self-critical. He ran it down, got it engraved just in time, and the engraver immediately saw that this was a masterpiece. And the editorial team at the Chicago Sun-Times was a tabloid, they decided that at the newsstands, they would show the newspaper instead of with the headline in the front page first, with this cartoon on the back. So the paper was displayed with this on the back. This became kind of the most requested cartoon in America in the 1960s.
And this, oddly enough, did not win a Pulitzer Prize.
No, it did not.
Probably,
No, it did not.
Probably should have.
Yeah.
Christopher, folks, we're just gonna go a few minutes long. That's just the way it is. I think this is gonna be a show that's gonna go to 105, hour and 5 minutes or so.
He's saying I'm talking too much.
Deal with it, people, and leave if you have to.
Let me share another cartoon that he did. And he did, how he would work is he'd be out and mix it up among people. He was the kind of artist where he tried writing novels, he tried writing screenplays, he tried doing oil paintings. He wanted to be an artist, but he never really could. He was not the kind of artist who could just create out of the richness of his imagination. He had to be mixing it up with people. He had to be in a war, in a conflict, in a battle, in a protest. And so he was constantly like seeking out conflict to cover. And one of the conflicts that he loved to cover, and I have to say that he really did like to cover it, was the civil rights movement. This was a really important thing to him. And, one day in 1962 or 1960, there's a coverage of some civil rights sit-ins and black kids, young men being beaten up by what Mauldin would call rednecks in the South. And he did this cartoon. Let that one go. He says he don't want to be my equal. And this was very much kind of Mauldin's approach to bullies. Again, that you've got to make fun of them to the point. You got to make fun of them in a way that they don't understand that they're being made fun of. And he always liked this cartoon, and he redid it 10 years later for the women's movement. My woman's okay. She says she don't want to be my equal.
So Todd, as you were researching the biography and researching Mauldin, did you ever come across anything where he commented on the fact that he has this large body of post-war work that says important things, but what people keep wanting to see are Willie and Joe?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
What did he say about that? I mean,
I would say that it was sometime in the 1980s, the mid 1980s, he reconciled himself to it, to an extent. He said, "I didn't create Willie and Joe; they created me. They created me." And he said, "I have to accept it, that people are only going to remember me for World War II, or I accept oblivion." It's either that or oblivion. That he knew, for a while there in the 60s and 70s, he would be called upon to talk about the civil rights movement. He'd be on the Today Show talking about Watergate or Hubert Humphrey or the upcoming election. But sometime in the 1980s, that all changed. He got displaced by a younger generation of political cartoonists, and now people he was like he was a throwback act. He was is that the term for it? Yeah. Throwback. Yeah. He was kind of a throwback act. Sure. He would go and give a talk on Reagan or the Contras or Iran, in 1980, 1982, and everybody would sit politely and listen to him what he had to say about those issues, and then they would ask him about World War II. He knew that he just could not escape it, no matter how hard he tried.
Chris, you have a story. You ran across Bill Mauldin at one time.
So my first job out of college was as a historian for the National Guard Association. And we were dedicating our new building in Washington. And there was going to be a big parade and guard units from all across the country. And this was right after the first Gulf War, which, as you know, Todd and maybe others do, he was very much opposed to. He had very strong feelings about that. So we invited him. He was with a bunch of dignitaries, and my job was to be the little gopher that just kind of helped make things happen. And we have everybody set up on the reviewing stand before the big parade's supposed to start, and there's no Bill Mauldin. and there are 1, 2, 3-star generals losing their nut, and my boss is screaming, and people are panicked, and they're like, Anderson, you get out there and you find him. So I start running down the parade route, and I knew enough to know, well, he's probably got to be with the 45th Division guys. So I find the Thunderbird contingent, and they're all young kids. They've just come back from the Gulf, this one unit. And there's this old guy, and I could see, and I know it's Bill, so I come up to him, and I'm about to say, excuse me, sir. And Mauldin says something, and he walks back into the crowd, and these two young soldiers are like, who's that son of a bitch? And the other's like, I don't know, some old guy, he's bitching about the war. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Long string of expletives, this liberal, anti-war, all that. And then from behind them comes this old-timer. And I don't know, he wasn't a World War II vet, but he was old. He had been around. He had a lot of medals on. He says, do you know who that old guy was? No, just some old fart. That's Bill Mauldin. That's Willie and Joe. And he could say whatever the hell he wants to.
What a great story.
And then Mauldin, I found him and got him on stage.
You finally did get him?
I got him on stage kicking and screaming.
Was he sober?
Yeah, well.
History doesn't record that fact.
Yeah, those were dark times for him in his life. But he loved those young soldiers. He did go to... He went for Desert Shield in November 1990 with Sam Donaldson, ABC News. And he absolutely they had no idea who he was, but he loved them. He said, every one of them is my son and grandson.
Yep.
He would do anything for them.
You could see him in the crowd, even though he was clearly having an argument with these two young kids. He was right in the middle of them, enlisted guys. His
arguments with those enlisted soldiers, that was a family argument.
Yep.
He saw them as his family.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We before we go, Todd, I want to touch on one more thing, which is, and there's so much more. We're getting a lot of great positive feedback for this show. I'm sure it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the wonderful questions Chris and I are asking you. But, the soldiers were his hero. The soldiers were heroes to him, but he was a hero to another cartoonist, Charles Schulz, and it's a really beautiful story, and you probably have a couple of cartoons you can show us about this and tell us just a little bit about that, which is also covered because there's an essay from Charles Schulz's wife in your book, Drawing Fire, which I'm showing and naming again.
Right. Yeah. Charles Schulz worshipped Mauldin. Charles Schulz thought Bill Mauldin was the greatest cartoonist who ever lived. And beginning in the late 1960s, Schulz would start doing a special cartoon for Veterans Day. And every year he would have Snoopy, like in this cartoon, put on his garrison cap. And Snoopy would go out and quaff a few root beers with Bill Mauldin. And every year, Schulz would sign the drawing and send it to Mauldin. Mauldin didn't know Schulz at all. And Mauldin had a bad habit of not opening up his mail all the time. And he would kind of put it in a bedroom and it would stack up. And I think he missed some of these drawings that were sent to him. But eventually he saw Schulz at some cartoonist convention and said, hey, Schulz, why you send me these? And Schulz said, I was a machine gun squad leader in France and Germany in World War II. I saw your cartoons and Stars and Stripes. They meant the world to me. And that was the bond. That was it. And the two men were able to enjoy some time together right at the end of Mauldin's life. When Mauldin was slipping into dementia, he had heavy drinking problems. Schulz really championed Mauldin and brought him to cartoonist conventions and made everybody celebrate the great man. And this is the final tribute that Schulz did before he died, November 11th, 1998. And I want you to take a look at this because Schulz did 10,000 cartoons over the course of his career from 1950 to about the year 2000. And never once did Schulz allow any assistant or anybody else to make a mark in the drawing. Schulz made all the art in Schulz's cartoons was his own, except for this one. This is the only cartoon of the 10,000 that shows another artist's work. And it's Willie and Joe marching down a muddy street, a battlescape. I think the new replacements are getting smaller all the time. And Snoopy says, Willie and Joe, my heroes. Happy Veterans Day, men. And I want you to look in the upper right by Schulz and my hero, Bill Mauldin. Mauldin was Schultz's hero to the very end. Jeannie Schultz will tell you, as she told me, that of all the awards that Charles Schultz received in his life, the only one that really meant anything to him was his combat infantry badge from World War II. He had been through combat.
And the great comment from Charles Schultz about Bill Mauldin, he drew great mud.
He drew great mud.
Todd DePastino, thank you so much for
so
joining
much, Todd.
us for a wonderful, if slightly long, history happy hour in a little bit. And again, Todd is the editor of a new book, Drawing Fire, the editorial cartoons of Bill Mauldin. Terrific. We've got an essay from Tom Hanks in there, and an essay from Tom Brokaw, and essays from other people, and lots of cartoons. Great book.
And check out Todd's biography of Bill Mauldin. And I've read the whole thing, Rick, so maybe
I can tell you the first 3/5 of it are great. I have no idea what's happening after that. But I have
a real snoozer.
that might be my review on Amazon. Todd, thank you so much.
Todd.
And if
Take
you'll
care.
hang on the line there a minute, we'd love to chat with you before you go away completely. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Wow, Chris, a great show there. Beautiful, and that's a beautiful
agree.
story. And we're going to really shift gears remarkably dramatically next
Are we?
week.
To what?
We are going to bring on Tom Standage, who's a deputy editor of The Economist. But what he's going to talk about is a book he wrote quite a while ago, but it is very apropos to History Happy Hour because it is called The History of the World in 6 Glasses.
Oh,
And it's the story of humanity from the Stone Age to the 21st century. We're going big here. Through the lens of beer, wine, spirits, coffee, tea, and cola, which, if you put them in a different order, could be the story of one single day in my life. But it's also all of humanity.
well, here's hoping that England continues to win their football matches, and then I'll have cola next week for the show. Otherwise, it's back to beer.
I don't even want to. Never mind. Not going there at all. Okay. It's been fun. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. I am only sorry that we couldn't get in more of your questions, but it was action-packed, and we appreciate everybody being here. Thank you so much.